Hi, my name is Lipika Goyal, and I'm a medical oncologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital Cancer Center. Thank you to Dr. Bridgewater and Dr. Merrick Bernstam and to the organizing committee for inviting me to give this talk on how to find a clinical trial for your patient. It's a topic that's dear to my heart, and I think to any oncologist that takes care of patients with an uncommon cancer, because we all know that clinical trials offer hope and give patients an option to get a drug years before it can be FDA approved. And so I'm excited to talk about this. And it's for an audience of both oncologists and patients and caregivers, because we all know that it can be a bit of a maze trying to identify the right clinical trial to go on as the next step. These are my disclosures. So I wanted to start with this slide to show the landscape of standard treatments in biliary tract cancers and really emphasize the point that all drugs that are standard today were first tested in clinical trials. And this landscape in biliary tract cancer highlights that there have been many different types of clinical trials that have led to standard treatments in this disease. And so we really need to rethink and reinvent the way we approach putting patients on clinical trials. And so let's first take ABC02. That was a phase 3 randomized trial, traditional drug development path, gemcitabine, cisplatin versus gemcitabine. 2 drugs are better than 1, and that became the standard. And then many years later, another chemotherapy trial, second-line FOLFOX. There was no standard at the time, so patients were randomized either FOLFOX with active symptom control or active symptom control alone. So half of the 162 patients did not get any anti-cancer therapy. So that's traditional drug development with randomized phase 3 trials. But as we know, since 2001, when Brian Drucker showed that imatinib led to dramatic responses in patients with BCR-ABL positive chronic myeloid leukemia, that there's a new way of approaching oncology with precision medicine. And now with these biomarker-driven trials, we're using a different approach to drug development and to FDA approval. And the FDA has partnered with the oncology community, with the pharmaceutical community, with patient advocates to offer accelerated approval based on phase 1 and phase 2 trials of drugs that look very promising. So examples of this are, pembrolizumab gained accelerated FDA approval in MSI-high positive tumors. And that's because in both colorectal cancer and non-colorectal MSI-high tumors, there was a high response rate and the responses were durable. And then that was a basket study. And similarly, larotrectinib and entrectinib in a basket study of patients with tumors with NTRK fusions. Again, a high response rate, durable responses. This got accelerated FDA approval. And that was based on multiple phase 1 trials. And then for pemigatinib, that was a single-arm phase 2 trial in patients with FGFR2 fusion or rearrangement positive cholangiocarcinoma. Again, a high response rate, durable responses, and that gained accelerated FDA approval. And so, for a long time, I think there's been this idea that we want to try to enroll patients on phase 3 trials, and we're a little bit more hesitant about phase 1 or first in human trials. But now that we do a lot of biomarker-driven trials, we're really seeing some dramatic responses in early phase trials. And so we can really think about how to approach these in a different way. So I'm going to first start with why clinical trials, then how has our approach to clinical trials changed, the role of biomarker testing in clinical trial eligibility, and finally some practical steps for navigating the maze of finding clinical trials on the web. So what is a clinical trial? A clinical trial is a prospectively planned experiment for the purpose of evaluating potentially beneficial therapies and treatments. And in general, these studies are conducted under as many controlled conditions as possible so that we can provide some definitive answers. Now, what are the different things that we think about controlling? So we have standard definitions of what a response is, what progression-free survival is, and so we have a standard approach at determining efficacy. We also have standard ways of grading toxicities, the side effects of the drugs, so we can really help understand with these clinical trials what is the incidence of different side effects and the tolerability. And then also, whenever you have a clinical trial, there's the scientific review board and the institutional review board, which is an ethical review board. And these committees ensure that the protocol is scientifically sound and ethical for patients to go on. So there are certain standards. And then because we have standard definitions of safety and efficacy, we can compare drugs and compare efficacy of different drugs by looking at different trials because we have standard definitions. And then finally, the FDA, the EMA, different regulatory bodies need a way to be able to evaluate different drugs. And through clinical trials, we have standard approaches of signaling to the FDA how safe and how effective different treatments are. And so how has our approach to clinical trials changed? So as I mentioned with the chemotherapy trials, which are all-comer trials, we often go through phase 1, where we're doing dose finding and looking at safety, then phase 2 to look at preliminary efficacy, and then phase 3, where the experimental treatment goes up against standard of care. That process can often take several years in order to complete. A new way that we're doing clinical trials in the last several years we'll often do a dose escalation phase 1. Sometimes it's a first-in-human study. And then once we've determined the maximum tolerated dose or the recommended phase 2 dose, we move on to the dose expansion. And this can be sometimes in select tumor types. And then we can also do further expansion cohorts, even with dose randomization, and this is a seamless expansion. But overall, many drugs are getting approved these days based on phase 1 data or even based on phase 2 data, and this is accelerating access for patients to these drugs. What's the role of biomarker testing? So when I talk to patients about trials, I often say that there are 3 different buckets of systemic therapy if we're talking about helping patients with advanced disease. There's chemotherapy like gemcitabine, cisplatin, FOLFOX. There's targeted therapies like drugs that help inhibit FGFR, IDH, BRAF, etc. And then there are immunotherapies like checkpoint inhibitors. There are also new vaccine trials, intratumoral injections. And a lot of trials now are combinations of a variety of these different systemic therapies or systemic therapies with local regional therapies. So thinking about what are the different types of options for patients and kind of discussing these 3 different buckets can be helpful for people to think about what the options are. So when we think about targeted therapies, we look at what are the different mutations that we see. And as we've long talked about in biliary tract cancers, we used to subtype biliary tract cancers by their anatomic location, so intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, extrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, and gallbladder cancer. And then we identified that within these subtypes, there are a series of different mutations that are actionable, and they're often oncogenic drivers. And so the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation has led this campaign, the Mutations Matter campaign, so that oncologists are doing next-generation sequencing on the tumors for patients, and patients are coming to their oncologists to ask for this. And biomarker testing is critical for eligibility in clinical trials, and there are all sorts of different types of biomarker testing. There's next-generation sequencing to look at the DNA level and try to understand what are the different mutations that could be driving the cancer. That can be done on tumor. You can also do liquid biopsies because sometimes in cholangiocarcinoma, there's a paucity of tissue from tumor biopsies. And so by collecting the DNA from the blood, you can do the circulating tumor DNA test and see if patients have certain kinds of alterations. And then there are also biomarkers for certain trials where it's done by the company centrally. And so you might have found the biomarker on a local test, but in order for the drug to be developed and get FDA approval, there needs to be a companion diagnostic. It needs to have central confirmation. Or it's a type of biomarker that you cannot check on a local test. Maybe it's a protein biomarker, such as you need immunohistochemistry. And so sometimes you have to send the tissue to the company. So it's important to think ahead about what kind of biomarkers we want to test for, because sometimes that biomarker testing can take a couple of weeks. So I will often do next generation sequencing, even when someone first walks in the door and first diagnosed, because there's some biomarker driven trials in the first line. And then also if people go on chemotherapy in the first line, there's certainly options in second line, and I want to be ready as soon as they progress to be able to go on to a trial. And what are the different approaches to precision medicine and uncommon cancer? I think of it in 3 different buckets, basically. There's the target-specific trials, so when there is a reasonable frequency of a target, such as IDH1, which is seen in about 15 to 20% of patients with intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, or an FGFR2 mutation or rearrangement or fusion, which is seen also in about 10 to 20% of patients. You can do target-specific trials because you have enough patients. When you have a biomarker that's more rare, so for example, BRAF or MSI high, BRAF is seen in about 4 to 5% of patients with intrahepatic cholangio. MSI high is probably seen in about 1 to 2% of patients. These we need to do more target-specific all-comer basket trials, and sometimes they have a biliary cohort, sometimes they don't. And an example of this is the pembrolizumab trial that was discussed on the first slide. And then sometimes there are umbrella trials with target-specific arms. So examples of this are the NCI MATCH trial, the ASCO-TAPUR trial, and there can also be biliary-specific umbrella trials, such as the ABC10 trial, where depending on which biomarker you have, you can be funneled into one arm or another that can be helpful to your patient. So biomarker testing for all is the message of this, to be able to see what kind of clinical trials people are eligible for. And finally, I'll talk about some practical steps for finding clinical trials on the web. So I'm going to talk about 3 types of resources. One is looking at patient advocacy organization websites. The second is national websites. And the third is the cancer center websites of your own cancer center, or for patients, cancer centers near you. So a quick plug for the Cholangiocarcinoma Clinical Trials website. It's really good. As you can see on the right, the trials are broken down into, is it a first-line trial? Is it a trial after first line? A chemotherapy trial, a targeted therapy trial, immunotherapy trial, radiation trial. They really break it down so you can try to find a trial that is right for your patient, or if you're a patient, that's right for you. And there's all sorts of helpful information about what are the drugs being given, is it randomized or non-randomized, who's the contact for that. So the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation is a great place to start when looking for trials for your patient. And then the next is the clinicaltrials.gov website. I have a series of slides on this because I think it can be a little bit confusing, especially for patients and caregivers to navigate this website, because there's a tremendous amount of information on it. So this is basically the website of the National Institutes of Health, and it's a great way to access trials in the US, in Europe, in Asia, really all over the globe. And here's an example. So if you type in cholangiocarcinoma into clinicaltrials.gov, you're going to get 602 studies. And it's hard to have the time to go through 602 studies. So as soon as you type that in and hit enter, on the left side, you're going to see a ribbon where you can specifically choose trials that are recruiting, adult trials, and interventional trials. And these will give you trials that are currently actively taking patients. And if you do that, now you have 148 patient studies. The next thing you might want to look at is what studies are open near you. So how do you find a clinical trial near you? So if you click on the On Map tab, I actually just found this in preparation for this talk. I didn't even know that this existed on clinicaltrials.gov, but it's certainly quite handy. And it is an option where you can see cholangiocarcinoma trials that are available across the globe. And then you can click on your country. So let's say if it's the United States, you can click on United States, and then you can click further on the state that you want. But also, if you live in Europe, you can click on a European country. If you live in Asia, you can click on an Asian country, and you can see where the different trials in all of these different countries. But let's say, for the sake of doing this in Utah, where the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation conference often is when it's not virtual, if you click on Utah, you see that there's 7 trials in Utah. And so this is a way that you can see clinical trials that are close to you. And on the right side, I'll specifically say what institutions they're open at. And if you type in cholangiocarcinoma, you see on the left side, this is what you get. If you type in bile duct cancer from the beginning, then you see you get a few more trials. And in the end, you end up getting 8 trials in Utah. So you have to play around with a little bit because different trials use different terminology. On clinicaltrials.gov, what kind of practical information is on the site? What phase it is it randomized or non-randomized? What are the treatment arms? What are the primary and secondary endpoints, such as overall response rate or overall survival? Key eligibility criteria, what are the active recruiting sites to see if it's at your cancer center or a cancer center near you? And also there's always study contact email and phone number that can be used to find out more about the study. And then one thing I just wanted to encourage is this idea of not being too narrow in our searches for clinical trials, because one of the things that COVID has done is it's really expanded our imagination about what delivering clinical trial care is going to be like in the post-COVID era. So one, it's important to think about how we can get access for the largest number of patients to clinical trials. So there are some financial resources that people can tap into. The Lazarus Foundation is a foundation that some of my patients have used in order to be able to get financial assistance, such as travel vouchers, payment for flights, and for accommodation. There's Angel Flights, which people have used to be able to get free flights back and forth for their clinical trial visits. Sometimes pharmaceutical companies offer travel reimbursement, again, to increase access. And sometimes a social worker at your cancer center may be able to provide some resources. So it's good to kind of take a wide stance and go and think about what are the options, even potentially beyond the local area, if a patient has the option of doing that. And then there's also the National Cancer Institute and the CIS-CRP, and these are also great websites to be able to access trials. And then finally, individual medical centers and cancer centers often have their own trial websites to be able to access trials. So in conclusion, in the era of targeted therapy and immunotherapy, we really need to rethink the way we do clinical trials and the way we think about phase 1 trials, first in human trials. I know Jackie is going to talk after me, and she's going to encourage everyone to not be scared of clinical trials. Really, I always think about it as a way of getting access to drugs, oftentimes well before, years before the FDA approves certain drugs. There are a lot of web-based resources, including the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation website and clinicaltrials.gov, and these are good places to start. And then financial assistance programs exist, and now there might be more remote delivery of clinical trial care because of what we saw was possible during COVID. So I think all of us, our imagination is expanding, and really I think of clinical trials as equaling hope for the patient sitting in front of us and for patients that we are yet to see. Thank you very much to all our patients and our caregivers who have the courage to volunteer for clinical trials, to the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation for putting this wonderful conference together to bring us all together, and of course, all of my colleagues.